What are some of the Pokémon never used in the Hoenn region across Generation 3 and 6? I found a survey conducted on what Pokémon people picked for their Hoenn gameplays, and the results were a bit interesting. Obviously there isn't data for every player in the world, but seeing a survey's average should give a general idea of who was and was not used. Starting with Wigglytuff. This Pokémon was picked by 15 people of the 1056 surveyed. Guess all those Jigglypuff cameos in the anime couldn't save its evolution from obscurity. This Saucerite Pokémon is only available by evolving Jigglypuff, when it's only attainable on Route 115 as a 10% encounter in a small patch of grass, only accessible by surfing north from Rustboro City. And considering its base stats and moveset, which boiled down to a mediocre mess in Generation 3, especially without the physical special split, it's no wonder people didn't seek out Jigglypuff all the way in the middle of nowhere just to use it. It's not that big of an issue in Generation 6, but at that point, the amount of options you have competing for the normal or fairy spot far outclass this balloon. By the time you even get to return to Rustboro City with a surf Pokémon, you probably already have a team you've trained well and bonded extensively with. It can at least learn some pretty good special moves through the use of TMs, but would you really use those precious limited use TMs back in Generation 3 on Wigglytuff over any of your actual powerhouses? I don't know if it's the design or stats, but people did not seem to like Probopass much, and honestly I do not blame them. With a pick rate of 1.3%, a total of 14 players surveyed decided to use a Probopass. I know, Probopass is only from Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and the poll may be a bit unfair towards it, but when 14 people alone used it regardless, I doubt the results would change much even if Probopass was in Generation 3, especially when none of the other later gen evolutions within Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire appear in this list anyway. Not to mention, this Pokemon is only attainable by evolving Nosepass, when it's a 16% encounter from Rock Smashing Way within the depths of Granite Cave. So unless you just love using Rock Smash everywhere, you probably wouldn't run into Nosepass in the first place. Not to mention the evolution only occurring while leveling up your Nosepass in New Mauville, where there aren't any trainers to fight, so have fun beating up all those Magnemites and Voltorbs. Accessibility aside, let's say you are a part of the 1.3% of players insane enough to do all of that for your very own Probopass. Good job! You got yourself a pretty great defensive wall with a pretty solid type combination for the rest of the game. Since you won't have one when fighting Brawly, you won't have to deal with its 4x weaknesses, making Wallace and Hoenn the only fights posing a bit of trouble for this Pokemon. And since it was never a part of Generation 3, it also never had to deal with having a terrible moveset, having access to all of its powerful moves by level 43. With a total of 12 players picking this one, Corsola is a Pokemon with atrocious base stats that was locked behind only 2 locations in game. Players could find this Pokemon as either the rarest Super Raw drop from Route 128 or Evergrande City, or an in-game trade in Pacifilog Town. It doesn't exactly have the most outstanding design either, being just a pink, rock. Additionally, this is one of the awkward Generation 2 Pokemon that haven't gotten their evolution yet, leaving it at its pitiful base stat total with mediocre defensive utility for what's supposed to be a defensive Pokemon. It got a few additions to its moveset in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, but clearly not enough to warrant additions to people's playthroughs, especially when only attainable that late into the game. Its typing isn't the worst for the role it performs in, being able to resist normal, fire, flying, and ice when they're all important trainer specialty types in the form of Flannery, Norman, Winona, and Glacia, especially being useful for pivoting in 3 consecutive gym battles in the mid-stretch of the game. Though ultimately, you're better off just using one of the more popular water types or just sweeping with a complete offensive team, as you're always going to have the EV advantage. Although Pinsir has a pretty cool design and a new Mega in Generation 6, its interest within the players doesn't seem to be piqued in the slightest, with only 11 players picking this Pokemon to use, and honestly understandably so when there were a lot of other Pokemon on the most picked list people would rather use their Mega evolutions on. Even excluding the Mega, this Pokemon isn't bad at all. It can put in some work with its pretty high base attack and slightly above average speed, so seeing it here is a bit surprising. I guess that goes to show how Pokemon picks lean more towards preference over power. Though that's not to say Pinsir is a massive powerhouse exactly, especially for being pretty late in the game within the Safari Zone when you probably already have an established team. Throughout the game, its type doesn't exactly give the player any advantage either, resisting none of the important trainer specialties and only being super effective against Sydney with its stab moves. Although to be fair, a Pinsir in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire would absolutely demolish Sydney, but clearly he's not difficult enough to warrant bringing in a specialty counter to deal with him alone. It also got its primary stab move, X-Scissor, in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, relying on Brick Break or Submission as its best level up move back in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Now to mention its Mega in Generation 6. This one is quite the powerhouse for the base games, boasting 105 speed with 155 base attack. This Pokemon will absolutely decimate anything in its path. Its new Flying type with its Aerolate ability allows it to throw out Stab Flying Thrashes as a level up move, or Strength and Return as TM moves. But if you're a real Pokemaniac, you could also bother getting Double Edge and Body Slam from the Generation 3 move tutors and transfer them over all the way to X and Y, just to have the top percent Pinsir, but that's highly inaccessible and I doubt anyone would go through the trouble of doing all of that, especially when power is never an issue for Mega Pinsir. Having access to Swords Dance at level 40 allowing for a single setup to one-shot pretty much any Pokemon around its level, as long as it's not resisted, that is. So while not being among the most used Pokemon by a long shot, this Pokemon is definitely no slacker and deserves better than to be on this list. Lying in the exact same spot as Pinsir, Volbeat was also used by 11 players. Volbeat and Illumise are both Firefly counterparts with nothing special about their designs or stats. This one is another rare encounter only available in Route 117 throughout the games in Generation 3 and 6. In Generation 3, Ruby and Emerald had it as a 4% encounter, whereas in Sapphire it was an 18% encounter. But in Generation 6, Omega Ruby had it as a 4% encounter, whereas in Alpha Sapphire it was a 20% encounter. There's no way to tell what games the players surveyed played, but what we can do is take the average of sales data. Considering Ruby and Sapphire sold 16.22 million copies worldwide, and Emerald sold 6.32 million worldwide, with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire selling 14.27 million worldwide. Let's say of all Hoenn players, there was a roughly 50-50 split on average between differing versions, considering trends from data on Japanese sales. So taking Ruby and Sapphire players as about 22% of the total each, totaling to about 44%. Emerald players as about 17.2% of the total. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire players as about 19.4% of the total each, totaling to 38.8%, and applying it to the total people surveyed, we get an estimated average as the following, which means about 39.2% of these people had a 1% chance of encountering Volbeat, while 19.4% of these people had a 4% chance of encountering Volbeat if they looked for Pokemon around Route 117. Whereas the other 19.4% had a 20% chance of encountering it, and 22% had an 18% chance of encountering it, all within a singular route with no mandatory grass patches. So unless they somehow knew of this Pokemon's location or bothered looking it up for the sake of getting this Pokemon, odds are they never knew of its existence within this route. It's not exactly good at anything in particular, and it strangely gets Tail Glow with a special attack stat of 47. Does it get any special moves by leveling up, you ask? Absolutely not. Not in Generation 3 anyway, since Bug was a physical type and Signal Beam was the best stab move it had. It got Bug Buzz in Generation 6, but Tail Glow is not saving that pitiful special attack stat regardless. Those stats should be enough to deter me from talking about its defensive utility, but to summarize it anyway, its typing does not do it any favors, only being slightly helpful against Sydney. An odd one to be all the way down here on the list is Spinda, what I consider to be a rather iconic Pokemon, being picked by only 10 of the people surveyed, though I suppose that's a testament to its power, or rather lack thereof. Spinda is also located in the iconic Route 113, being filled with grass patches pretty hard to avoid. This Pokemon is the mascot of the place, being a whopping 70% encounter in Generation 3, while being a 60% encounter in Generation 6, and a 95% encounter from Hordes. I guess either being Arceus Light isn't exactly appealing for most players, or they just aren't a fan of the Chill Panda design. Its moveset isn't particularly bad even in Generation 3, getting access to Dizzy Punch fairly early on, though it doesn't provide anything outstanding of value, being a plain normal type with no resistances apart from ghost or super effective stab moves. Its plain normal typing also hinders its defensive utility, providing no useful pivots especially with those defensive stats. Basically, it still has no real use over some of the more fonder Generation 3 normal types, such as the Slackoth or Tailo available early on that most players get, turning them away from the addition of another normal type to the team, especially a mediocre one in comparison. Another Safari Zone victim on this list is Girafarig, with only 9 people having used this Pokemon, being the first one on this list to enter the single-digit usage numbers. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire did try to somewhat fix this by adding it to Mirage Mountain, but that needs no explanation as to why it didn't help. Though within the Safari Zone, being a 20% encounter in the first area meant it wasn't terribly rare. But when the Safari Zone is completely optional in this region, I can say from personal experience a lot of people probably never entered in the first place. Its design is quite simple, nothing unique or anything that stands out much, but its tail is a nice little detail, kinda like Slowbro's. Its base stats are solid for its role, with 90 special attack and 85 speed. Its slightly above average speed allows it to outspeed a majority of the game, and its attack stat is good enough to deal meaningful damage to Pokemon it's effective against. And to no one's surprise, its Generation 3 moveset was also a letdown, with Psybeam being its strongest stab move only available all the way at level 43, leaving it mediocre without the use of some crucial TMs such as Psychic. Generation 6 fixed this though, right? Hey look, there's Psychic, all the way at level 50. At least it gets Nasty Plot now, which makes it a pretty good Pokemon all things considered. Its Psychic normal type leaves it pretty neutral type-wise, only being weak to Sydney defensively and Psychic being pretty helpful offensively. But when there's plenty of competition for the Psychic slot of the team, most notably Gardevoir, there's no reason people would bother replacing anyone within an established team with a Girafarig. Seaking is one of the indirectly uncommon Pokemon of this list, with only 7 people surveyed having used it. Seakings directly in the wild aren't the most common find, being only available in the Safari Zone waters with the use of a Super Rod, being a 20% encounter in Generation 3, and a guaranteed encounter in Generation 6. Goldeen on the other hand is found almost everywhere. Every single body of water in the game, odds are it has a Goldeen in it. It's like the Zubat of the seas alongside Magikarp. Being a water type, its competition is already sky high, especially with Hoenn renowned for its water. Its stats do not do it any favors in helping win people over either. It has a solid attack stat but not enough speed to help make it meaningful, and with those defenses, it being outsped will generally lead to it being killed in 1 or 2 hits. Though it is unique in the sense of being a pure water type unlike most of the other water Pokemon in Hoenn. This helps since there aren't important grass trainers in this region, making Watson the only trainer this Pokemon would be bad against. Its best level up move was a Stab Waterfall at level 41 in Generation 3, and level 32 as a Goldeen in Generation 6. At least it got Agility, all the way at level 61. But again, Generation 6 fixed this and made it accessible at level 29 as a Goldeen. But still, would you really pick this Pokemon over Gyarados, Sharpedo, or anything of the sort? Even design-wise, it's just a glorified goldfish, so it's understandable why people would gloss over it without hesitation. And with how common this goldfish is, its perceived value is not particularly high either, considering as mentioned how common its pre-evolution is. Volbeat's less popular twin Illumise was picked by 5 people in total, getting less than half the love of the other. Located in the exact same spot, its odds are the exact opposite of Volbeat across the versions. Although being more prominent across more games numerically, it still falls flat in comparison to its counterpart. Stat-wise it's similar to Volbeat, but has a higher special attack instead of attack. This definitely would be better overall, if it kept Volbeat's tail glow. Instead, all it gets are physical and support moves such as Helping Hand and Encore in Generation 3. Generation 6 did somewhat try to fix this by giving it special bug moves, but it's still stuck with a base 50 power struggle until level 40, which at that point this Pokemon becomes pretty useless. Just like Volbeat and Pinsir, its pure bug typing doesn't exactly help defensively or offensively much, only being useful against Sydney. Overall, this Pokemon is not that different from its counterpart, with the disparity in pick rates more likely than not being a product of affinity towards this Pokemon. Luvdisc. At a whopping 3 people totaling to 0.3% of all people surveyed, the last one on this list is Luvdisc. Although helpful for Emerald Kaizo Nuzlocke for most, this Pokemon in the base games unfortunately serves no real purpose, doesn't seem to be too particularly liked either. Its design is also a simple one, being just a basic heart-shaped fish. In a region filled with excellent water types all over, it's hard for people to justify using a Luvdisc over probably anyone else. It's also only found in 2 places in the entire game, fishing in Route 128 or Evergrande City with encounter rates of 20% with a good rod and 40% with a super rod in Generation 3, and 35% with a good rod and 60% with a super rod in Generation 6. Apart from being a bit faster than average, this Pokemon doesn't really excel at anything and has a base stat total of many unevolved Pokemon without having an evolution of its own. Is there even a need to mention the level up move pool in Generation 3 at this point? It starts off alright, but gets absolutely nothing later on. Generation 6 did fix this again, but when it takes over 30 levels to get a Water Pulse upgrade, it could definitely still be better. Its defensive stats are higher, so I guess it tries to be a defensive Pokemon early on, but you won't be able to use its typing as defensive utility until you get to Flannery. Although it could provide some fast charms if you really needed them against the earlier fights such as Roxanne or Brawly, but clearly most players here didn't care for that. Although unique in their own ways, these Pokemon never got much love amongst Hoenn fans across the generations. Ranging from usability, designs, and availability, many factors contribute to the poor reception of these Pokemon. While some are decent in one of those categories, they usually come up a bit short compared to the other fan favorite Pokemon while lacking in the other categories entirely. Though from the data, there does seem to be the trend of people picking Pokemon based on design preference over battle ability, with availability being an almost non-factor, which makes sense since people would want to do anything to use their favorites. But regardless, this goes to show that no matter how unpopular Pokemon may be, it will always have its one fan that will even go through getting a Munchlax in Generation 4 to use it in a playthrough.